Welcome to my economics channel, where I love discussing the subject, but most importantly, I love to make something fun and interesting to learn. And to that end, today I want to discuss the video on how we end consumerism, why degrowth must happen. I mentioned the text in the thumbnail because that's going to be a very important theme for the video, but basically the theme of the video is that consumerism is bad and everything else that goes along with it, or the supposedly useless stuff that we buy, things that supposedly don't make us happier. They only put us on a hedonic treadmill. You buy more stuff, but you stay in the same place. All that sort of stuff is really bad and it produces a lot of waste. And this is why we need degrowth. What I want to do in my rebuttal is show a little bit more nuance. So that yes, our situation right now is really bad and there is no denying that. In fact, I show a number of graphs and charts further into the video, which show just how bad the situation is. However, on the flip side, we have been making great strides in the last 20 years and especially in the last 10 years in many major economies around the world. As you'll see, the US does stand out as a country that needs to do a lot of work in this regard. However, a lot of other countries have stepped up to the plate, and per capita, i.e. per person, emissions and the production of rubbish, or simply the production of waste, is actually decreasing, even as GDP, both absolute GDP and per capita GDP, is actually increasing. And one of the things I hope you'll take away from this is that there are solutions, and there is hope that as technology continues to improve, the situation itself will continue to improve. And so, as I'll show in my video, capitalism and consumerism can indeed save the planet. But as you'll also see, there is a heavy dose of irony in the video, which I'll go into further. This is just a bit of a teaser for it. However, without any further ado, let's get into the claims made by the video, and I hope you'll enjoy this soothing B-roll.
In the global north, overconsumption runs rampant. Whether it's a brand new Tesla Model S or a nice pair of jeans, buying for status, acceptance, desire, or because of that Instagram ad are all ingrained in our conception of success and mental well-being. Under capitalism, we buy the right things as a way for us to seek acceptance from and connection with our peers. The barrage of ads we encounter every day equate smiles with khakis, suaveness with sunglasses, and even love with headphones. But this drive to purchase that new Swiffer wetjet or that new car is not an inherently biological trait. Our quest for more, our relentless overconsumption, is a symptom of capitalism.
And we're off to the races. Waste, consumerism, consumption, and capitalism. Naturally, the way capitalism is framed here is as a modern invention, and supposedly advertising is making us buy all of this, what they call useless stuff. Supposedly stuff that doesn't make us happy or improve our lives in any way, shape, or form. All of these are modern woes that simply didn't exist in the past. The implication is that this is a modern construction which has created a modern problem. All of these claims have to do with a seeming imperative for infinite growth on a finite world. Therefore, according to the video, that's why degrowth must happen to save the planet. And yet, how true is that historically? So a lot of claims are made here, and there is a lot to unpack. So let's get into it. Let's look at the history aspect first. From the book The Great Divergence, China, Europe, and the Making of the Modern World Economy, we get that around 1400, there is a large increase of people using goods to define themselves, even as popular works decried this trend. Basically, what was becoming a middle class, or something approximating a middle class, was trying to emulate the rich by buying things only available to the rich previously. And then as a result, the rich shifted their consumption to other items of status that were now out of the reach of this emerging middle class, for lack of a better term. But as the Industrial Revolution took off and further lowered prices, this cycle continued. Large numbers of writers complained that these trends drained the wealth of society, bankrupted noble families, and undermined more important measures of status and human worth. Throughout Europe, governments and religious institutions tried, at least intermittently, to arrest these tendencies, but with little success. Increasingly, people defined themselves through the tireless accumulation of possessions. End quote. And so this imperative to buy goods to increase your own status, or to try to increase your own status, went back to at least the 1400s. This is not a new phenomenon. And indeed, what is implied by this paragraph is that people have always wanted to do this. It's just that now, around the 1400s, is when a greater majority of people could afford to do so. The author also notes that it was the demand for goods that helped spur the Industrial Revolution and rapid output of goods, rather than the increased supply creating an increase in demand. But we also delve further in The Mind and the Market, Capitalism in Western Thought. We get the following cycle in reference to the 1760s and the 70s. Quote, "What had once been regarded as luxuries came to be seen as mere necessities. What had been decencies had become necessities, and the very definition of necessities changed. Objects once reserved for the rich now came into the reach of a larger part of society. Goods once produced laboriously at home, such as clothes, beer, candles, cutlery, and furniture, could now be purchased instead." End quote. And this is important because then we get, quote, "What was new was not the desire to consume, it was the ability to consume that was unprecedented, made possible by the increase in national wealth and the declining cost of goods." And so now, to understand the consumer revolution, we can delve even further into history, and we get this from the Enlightened Economy, an economic history of Britain, 1700 to 1850. Quote, "The consumer revolution, as it has been called, clearly preceded the Industrial Revolution and has been attributed to a growth in household earnings stimulated by the new and desirable goods that were coming online in the 17th century and which prompted people to work more to generate the cash that made them accessible." End quote. And so, much like the author in the video, it is easy to take the consumerism we have now for granted, but it certainly wasn't in the past. Between the 1820s and 1850s, even as the Industrial Revolution spread into more industries and affected the lives of more people, consumption actually didn't increase that much, and during this period, men and women were shorter, and they were not consuming as many calories as they had previously. And so production, consumption, and consumerism in general cannot be taken for granted, and it certainly wasn't taken for granted in the past. It's worth looking at a theoretical paper on the subject. From source 4, and from page 4, the author finds that long-run growth can be sustained even if substitution between input materials and natural resources is less than unity, i.e. 1. This holds if substitution of different resources is greater in the knowledge-using sector than in the knowledge-competing sector. So the way I read this, and I'm happy to be proven wrong, is that if an industry or a company uses 100 tons of an input, but then has to substitute for another input that requires 110 tons for the same output, that can still lead to sustained long-run growth if this occurs in the knowledge-using sector. And this is all done under market conditions using prices rather than mandates. And the authors conclude, quote, "However, we have shown that with poor input substitution, the knowledge spillovers can only sustain growth if substitution in the sector for which innovation is developed is larger than in the sector without innovation opportunities. In this case, the increasing scarcity price of resources makes the sector without innovation opportunities relatively expensive, shifting consumer demands towards the innovating sector and increasing the incentives for innovation." End quote. And so the point being, even though we can't perfectly substitute for oil, it's still our best input as an energy source, we can still get long-run growth if we keep getting innovation in the right sectors and consumer demands shift appropriately. Naturally, the caveat here is that these conclusions come from a theoretical paper and should be treated as such. However, if they play out in the real world, these are very promising conclusions.
In addition to its impact on individuals' self-conception and mental health, capitalist overproduction and subsequent overconsumption, especially in the global north, drives massive waste, emissions, and pollution.
So there is a ginormous, massive irony at play here, of course. Degrowth would lead to fewer consumer products and services, fewer related jobs, and eventually a lower population. And following that, less technical innovation. And then this also means less research and development into innovation means less innovation and fewer things in the future. Imagine that degrowth had started in the 70s, 80s, or the 90s. What if the internet hadn't exploded in use and usefulness over this time? You almost certainly wouldn't have YouTube, for example, and you wouldn't have this channel complaining about economic growth. Indeed, you would have this same person or team complaining about the lack of growth and lack of cool things to buy and experience. And according to the segment, supposedly green growth doesn't work, and neither does decoupling. And so the conclusion is that degrowth is the only solution. On that note, we have this source which says, 21 countries are reducing carbon emissions while growing GDP. Since 2000, more than 20 countries have reduced annual GHG emissions while growing their economies. And this includes a very impressive list of countries that have lowered their emissions whilst increasing GDP over this period. Now, I don't want to go into depth here, just because this is, of course, just one source. It could be biased, but also to show that the issue is much more nuanced than what is being portrayed in the video. We can find evidence on both sides showing that either decoupling does work or that decoupling isn't working. My point behind showing this source is that we have evidence to the contrary, and I want you to see both sides of the argument before making up your own mind. But rather than rely on just one source, shortly I'm going to show a series of graphs which I hope prove to be a bit more persuasive regarding the whole issue of decoupling, green growth, and just growth in general, and the idea that we can in fact lower emissions whilst growing per capita GDP. In the meantime, I definitely recommend having a look over this source. And so just before I go into the graphs, it should be noted that we do produce a lot of waste and a lot of plastic, and we do need to reduce our emissions. So how is all of that going? Let's now look at the series of graphs. Here we have raw output of global plastics production between 1950 and 2015. That is indeed a very terrifying looking graph, and it looks like it's only going to increase into the future. There was a small dip in the mid-70s, and that was when we had the really high double-digit inflation. And we see another dip around 2007 and 2008, with of course the global financial crisis and all the problems that caused around the world. And if this went up to 2020 or 2021, we would see yet another dip, when the majority of the world shut down due to, of course, the COVID virus. However, there is no denying the fact that this is quite a terrifying graph on its own. We can look at another graph which is cumulative global plastics production from 1950 to 2015. And so once again, this is a very ugly looking graph, and it's very hard to see when the dip will start happening and when that could possibly happen. 10 billion tons, 15 billion tons, 20 billion tons. That's a very, very steep line. However, let's get another viewpoint. Those are the raw numbers. Those are the aggregate numbers. As our population increases, we produce more things, including, of course, plastics and pollution. However, we can see that global CO2 emissions per capita have actually started to dip. Since about 1990, it's dipped and then increased, and it's starting to dip again. And so even as world population is increasing, the per capita global CO2 emissions is actually relatively flat, and indeed could be dipping once again. And so the story behind this is that as technology improves, we can actually reduce per capita, per person CO2 emissions around the world, even as the global economy continues to grow. And so here we have per capita plastic waste versus GDP per capita in 2010. And so of course we have something like the United States, which has a high GDP per capita and also produces a lot of plastic waste. However, we also have countries like Canada, Sweden, Qatar, UK, Japan, Russia, Romania, and so on. They have relatively high GDP per capita, but they actually produce less waste per person. And so those economies are more efficient than the United States. Of course, there are pretty bad outliers, like for example Sri Lanka, or Maldives, or the Seychelles, St. Lucia, Barbados, Guyana, Antigua and Barbuda. But the thing is, there is hope on the horizon. you can increase GDP per capita and lower per capita plastic waste. And here is a map showing plastic waste generation per person in 2010. The United States, of course, stands out in this regard. However, once again, we can see that there are some wealthy countries on this map that have relatively low plastic waste generation per person. Here is another map showing carbon emissions per unit of GDP by country. And we can see that the US has done quite a lot of work since 1990, even if it is still above the other countries. And so it's growing per capita GDP. However, per capita carbon emissions are going down. And so, of course, there is much more work to be done, but this is quite promising. And once again, as technology continues to improve, we can expect the situation, especially in the wealthier countries, to improve. There is, of course, work to be done with the poorer countries, but that is something we can focus on later. First, we need to focus on the wealthier countries and getting their per capita carbon emissions down even further. Since, of course, it is the wealthier countries that have emitted the most pollution thus far around the world. Here we can see the share of plastic waste that is inadequately managed back in 2010. And so we can see that most of the wealthier countries manage their plastic waste quite well as compared to the poorer nations. And so we can expect that as these nations grow richer, they will actually get better at managing their plastic waste and thus reducing the amount of pollutants they release into the atmosphere. And here we can see mismanaged plastic waste per capita versus GDP per capita. And you can see that this time the United States is looking quite good. China could be better. And then of course you have the outliers that I was mentioning before, but we can expect that this situation will improve over time. Here we have production versus consumption-based CO2 emissions per capita in Europe. And you can see that it's actually been trending down for the last 10 years, which is not bad given how much GDP per capita has risen over this period. You will notice that consumption-based emissions per capita have actually been above production-based emissions per capita, so there is of course work to be done. However, on the whole, this is looking quite promising, or certainly more promising than what is portrayed in the video that I'm critiquing. Here we can see that carbon efficiency is increasing steadily. These are global CO2 emissions per GDP per capita. And so once again, this is a much more positive story than what has been spun by the video. I thought I would hone in on particular countries, and in this case my home country of Australia, and here we can see production versus consumption-based CO2 emissions per capita. And here, production-based and consumption-based are tracking each other much more closely. And so here we seem to be doing better than the EU, whereas previously we had a large gap between the two. And so since about 2012, 2013, Australian businesses are becoming more efficient and actually producing less per capita CO2 emissions. And business CO2 emissions per capita are still decreasing. And here we have energy use per capita with the United States, Russia, and the UK. All of them, once again, are decreasing. And the decrease is especially pronounced in the UK and the United States since about the early 90s, even as both economies have experienced strong growth since. And honing in once again, we have production versus consumption-based CO2 emissions for the United States. And a similar story to Australia, however much more dramatic, is the decrease in both production-based CO2 emissions and consumption-based CO2 emissions. It's good to put all of this into perspective, and here we have per capita CO2 emissions for a select few countries. You can see Australia, United States, South Africa, China, UK, we have the world average, then we have Brazil and India. And so naturally per capita emissions for the UK, Australia, and the United States were quite high, but there is a significant decrease that's happened in the past few decades. And so once again, even though there is quite a lot of work still to be done, and we certainly can't get complacent, the situation is improving over time. In this graph, we can see the correlation of energy consumption and GDP per person, and naturally the United States stands out in this regard. However, we can't fail to miss Canada, which has an equivalent per capita energy consumption, however, is not as rich as the United States. And so Canada also has quite a lot of work to do in this regard. And getting straight to the point of what I was mentioning previously, this is from the link that I was showing before. Here we have a decoupling of UK GDP and CO2 emissions from 2000 to 2014. So GDP is increasing, whereas CO2 is actually decreasing. Here we have the United States, where the story is not so simple, where GDP is increasing, however, so is CO2. However, once again, since about 2006, 2007, 2008, it's actually started to fall down. And it's expected that before 2025, the lines will actually cross, and then we'll see a proper decoupling of the US economy regards to GDP and US emissions. And so, as the US example at the end shows, the story of CO2 pollution, plastics production, and GDP per capita is quite a complicated one. Clearly, the US has a lot more work to do in this regard, and it definitely stood out in the series of graphs I just showed. However, even as bad as the aggregate numbers are, the per capita numbers for the majority of the developed world are looking very encouraging. And given the history, there is hope that new technology can further reduce per capita CO2 emissions and plastics waste. For poorer nations, there is hope that by utilizing the latest technology, they too can begin to lower emissions whilst enjoying robust growth. I hope the evidence I have presented thus far, alongside the graphs that I have just shown, have helped paint a more optimistic picture of pollution and growth, but more importantly, a more realistic one.
It means buying less, repairing, reducing meat consumption, and no second homes on the individual level. But ultimately, degrowth cannot function as just individual lifestyle choices. Systemic pathways, like subsidizing all housing retrofits, redistributing all food waste, dramatically expanding public transportation methods.
You might say people shouldn't be allowed to invest their money into a second home, for example. Okay, but then where should people invest their money instead? The vast majority of Americans' wealth is in their home, and so if they can own a second one, why not? Why stop them from increasing their equity and net worth? Regarding the point about what to do to reduce emissions, you could also put in place a carbon tax, like an emissions trading scheme. How is that working out for Europe? Not too bad, actually. As we can see with these sources, it is mixed, but it does seem to be getting better, even if it's incrementally over time. And so once again, there is hope that into the future, the emissions trading scheme can become more efficient and can force even more companies to begin lowering their emissions. And this is all done within a free market framework. Regarding food redistribution, there are already organizations that redistribute food that would have gone to waste in most cities around the world. And this is done without government mandates and within a capitalist and free market system. Regarding public transport, it should be noted that public transport only works in high-density cities. If their dream of degrowth occurs, we won't have high-density cities anymore, and hence we won't have any further need for public transport. Or at the very least, we're not going to get much development into public transport.
And a robust emphasis on low-carbon, care-oriented jobs like educators, therapists, and in-home care providers.
And there you go. Now they want to mandate what kind of jobs should exist. What gives the team behind this channel the right to decide what kind of jobs should and shouldn't exist? What gives them the right to have their current jobs? What if someone else said that the people behind this team have jobs that are helping ruining the environment, i.e. by contributing to YouTube and consumerism in general? How would the team respond to that charge?
Consumers could cut their energy consumption rate by 95% and still live well with a combination of efficiency technologies and alternative lifestyle choices. In addition, they found a global reduction of energy consumption by 60% is not only feasible, but also could be done in a way that brings a comfortable lifestyle to every single person on this planet.
You can't make this stuff up. How and where are these technologies going to come from if not for more investment and the prospects for future growth? Remember, in a degrowth environment, there is less prospect for future growth, and hence there is going to be less R&D, and that means less investment and less technologies and just less things in the future. Technology is not gifted to us from above. It must be earned. There must be research and development. However, if we're talking about a degrowth world, then this R&D will not happen in the first place, and we will not get these promising new technologies in the future. Alright, so the rest of the video does go off the rails and is not worth commenting on. However, they do describe worker cooperatives, which is something that already exists. This is a big topic in itself, and I actually have made another video which goes into the topic. And I wanted to end my specific critique there because, as I said, there's nothing else that's worth responding to in the rest of the video. But once again, that doesn't mean we don't have a problem with production, growth, and waste right now. It's worth looking into the complicated stats behind the use of materials between 1900 and 1990. So we go to source 2. We see that these stats were all collected in 1996, and the results cover the period from 1900 to 1990. The story of material use, both absolute and per capita, is a complicated one. Metals and minerals actually saw declining per capita use even as absolute use increased from 1970 to 1996. Forest products saw relatively flat per capita usage over this period. Meanwhile, non-renewable organics saw increased per capita usage over this period. Quote, Rogich found an increase in the absolute consumption of materials from 142 million metric tons in 1900 to 2.5 billion metric tons in 1989, end quote. However, Rogich finds that per unit of GNP, gross national product, overall materials IU, that's intensity of materials use, declined from 1970 to 1990, a trend he attributed to the fact that services are contributing a growing share to our GNP. And then we get the following quote. The IU, weight per dollar GNP, for plastic, aluminium, potash, and phosphorus increased from 1900 to 1990, whereas IU for timber, copper, steel, and lead declined. For the entire US economy, Wernick and colleagues, 1996, found that IU as measured by weight per dollar GNP declined by 1/3 from 1970 to 1990. However, the author cautions that the use of less materials on a per capita basis doesn't necessarily translate to being better for the environment. For example, he says that using aluminium instead of steel is actually more damaging to the environment, and substituting wood with plastic poses significant disposal and recycling issues. Lighter cars might use less petrol, but steel is easy to recycle, whereas the composite materials used in lighter cars are difficult to recycle. So fuel consumption goes down, but there may be an overall increase in waste produced and resources consumed. From source 3, this paper focuses on investment of the steel industry in Poland. They found that increased investment by the steel companies typically led to more efficiency, decreasing resource intensity for steel production, and this was done between 2004 and 2018. From the book Animal Spirits, How Human Psychology Drives the Economy and Why It Matters for Global Capitalism, we see the authors stating that the standard theory, whereby people are supposed to balance saving with consumption, is actually wrong, and that people make poor spending choices all the time, and in fact they undersave. We could say that these people are over-consuming, and thus this will make it harder for them to retire in old age. And so superannuation schemes, like what we have in Australia, are popular because they take the choice from people and force people to save more for retirement so that they are not a burden on the economy and the state. People are forced not to be consumers so that they are less of a burden to the government in old age. This could be seen as mandating against one of the pitfalls of consumerism, especially given people's propensity to buy things they don't necessarily need. From source 1, we see clearly that the growth in the production of stuff, whether goods or services, matters to our economy. From page 13, as Broadberry, 1998, page 376 concludes, quote, both Germany and the United States overtook Britain in terms of aggregate labor productivity, largely by shifting resources out of agriculture and by improving comparative labor productivity in services, rather than by improving comparative labor productivity in manufacturing, end quote. The paper argues that growth came first, allowing workers to move out of agriculture and into other industries. It wasn't a matter of tariffs allowing people to leave agriculture and then go into manufacturing to help produce more stuff. The growth aspect came first, and that allowed people to leave the agriculture sector. However, this would not be possible without capitalist-like systems and without the growing demand for more goods and services. So what I hope that I've done with my video is not to try to paint a rosy picture of what's going on. I really want to paint a positive picture, yes, but one that's ultimately more realistic. The video has obviously got an ideological bent to it. It shows sources that basically agree with its own conclusions, and it doesn't show much of the data or the sources or the graphs otherwise. And as I've shown, things have improved over the last 20 and especially the last 10 years, and we can expect that as time goes on, things will only continue to improve. Technology will improve, and there's hope that as poorer nations begin to use better technology, they can start actually decoupling their own economies so that they can get higher GDP but lower waste per capita. And so that's all I wanted to say in this video. I hope you enjoyed the in-depth bit at the end as well, but thank you for watching. So if you wouldn't mind subscribing to see more of my content, leave a comment or any other sort of feedback down below. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask, and I'll do my best to answer, or at the very least, I'll collate the questions into another video and answer them there. But thank you for watching, and I hope to see you guys next time.